Bet the board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will. Yeah, right. I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Fuhrman.
Welcome into the Bet the Board podcast, part of the Wondery Podcast Network. And, you know, here we are in the wake of Super Bowl 57, and I feel like I've lied to our loyal listeners. I'm your host, Todd Fuhrman, joined as always by my esteemed colleague and co-host, the one, the only Payne Insider. And Payne, I told people we were done with football season 2022-2023, and here we are just a few short days later trying to review and process everything we saw on Super Bowl Sunday.
A man of the people. They wanted a Super Bowl recap. This is the first time since inception that we're going to give them one. I hear your viewing experience, not the best.
It was a little different. I'm not going to lie. It's always good to be in and around the event itself and take in the scene.
Stop for a second. I heard your viewing experience wasn't the best.
You mean watching a game without audio, trying to track play-by-play on various live betting apps and some of the bigger media companies that are out there isn't the ideal way to watch things for the biggest football game of the year?
That would be brutal. Hopefully you were well compensated. Did you at least go back and watch for a second?
I went back and watched parts of it. I didn't watch the game in its entirety, but did watch a lot of what I missed in real time. And the one thing I will say, it's always different when you're watching with people in media, you're watching with former players, and got into a bit of a spirited discussion with two former Florida State football players that I found pretty interesting. And we'll get to some of the games, our takeaways, and all of that. But had a chance to talk to Brian McFadden and Danny Cannell.
Yep.
Proud Florida State alums, about the decision-making process that goes into going for two. And I actually texted you about it when the Kansas City Chiefs scored early in the fourth quarter. We can get to that a little bit later in the show, but people don't necessarily care what my biggest takeaway from the game is. They obviously want to know how you processed it, what you saw, and if anything really stood out when you watched that game back a second time.
So there was a lot of questions within that, and we could go a million directions.
And that's what we can do here. That's the luxury we have.
I think initially the Eagles' game plan was the one we expected with keep away. The path they took to get there was a little bit different. We fully anticipated Mahomes having success here. And that was one thing that we outlined, that we said, hey, like, this is going to happen. Expect it. And you just look at Mahomes in that quick passing game underneath. On 65% of Mahomes dropbacks, he released the ball within 2.3 seconds. Okay. And those throws averaged about 5.7 yards in terms of depth of target. And you rewind our Super Bowl preview, and it's like, sure, right, the Eagles have the number one pass defense, but it was a really poor schedule. They had been beaten up on throws underneath, and we've seen the evolution of the Chiefs and Patrick Mahomes with all the too high shell they were seeing, right? And now all of a sudden they've matured a little bit, and they had the 9th highest rate of throws 1 to 9 air yards this season. And you look at all of Mahomes' throws in this game, 78% of them were within 10 yards of the line of scrimmage. And it's just that maturity, that willingness to take what you're given. You go back and look at all of the throws in 2.3 seconds. Mahomes' adjusted accuracy was over 94%, averaged over 8 yards per pass attempt on those throws. So he was allowing guys to run after the catch. He was placing the ball perfectly. All of his touchdowns came on throws that averaged 2.34 seconds or less. So I think what's interesting is, like, stylistically, the way the Eagles were playing defense, Mahomes was expected to complete 68% of his passes. He was 10% over that expectation. But being expected to complete nearly 69% of your throws, it tells you the offense had a good game plan. They were in the right play. They felt like they were in control of things. And the Eagles weren't in the right defense. And because Mahomes is the talent he is, he far out-executed what was expected of him. And so that wasn't overly shocking to me. I think maybe, and feel free to chime in here. We, I think, had a different viewpoint of the Eagles' ability to get pressure compared to like 99% of the talking heads out there. No,
I mean, you mentioned that, and I didn't want to cut off your thoughts, so I'll jump in. I'll see if you hit on it, and then I'll ask a follow-up if need be, but go ahead. Sorry about that.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of, we saw some rogue numbers at open that we talked about, right? You got 6.5 under sacks, and it just wasn't widely available. There were some 6 out there. By the time we recorded our podcast, it was 5.5 juiced under, and so I was like, I don't really want to give out a beat up number, and I don't really want this thing to fall 6 and have listeners lose and us win. But some of the sharpest prop bettors are still going under 5.5 on game day. And it just felt like there was some recency bias in full effect. There was like this failure to understand the Eagles defense played poor competition and had those poor offenses in poor situations, right? It's like a lot easier to get pressure when you're up 28-10 to start the third quarter of a regular season game against, a rookie quarterback. and all the Steelers can do is drop back and pass, and you can kind of treat that depth you have along the defensive line like a hockey rotation. But we just didn't think Kansas City was going to allow a ton of pressure here because of all the little things that they could do and all of the players that they have. I mean, Mahomes had 31 dropbacks in the game. Now, not a lot volume-wise, and that's something we can touch on here in a little bit, right? His passing attempts was like 39.5. He literally only dropped back 31 times. He attempted 27 passes, took off, ran 4 times. He was only under pressure on 7 of his 31 dropbacks, 22%. That was about 12% lower than the Eagles' average this season. It was all the things that we discussed, just adding up, right? Quick, short passes, Reed using motion, forcing guys like Sweat and Reddick and Graham to think about run and contain the edge. The Chiefs' O-line played extremely well, right? I mean, Andrew Wiley was fantastic relative to competition. That's probably the weak link on the line. They were motivated for 2 weeks hearing about how they were going to be dominated, and certainly like it's the Super Bowl, like can you get the decibel level above 100? But certainly they were a little bit more focused. They took that to heart and showed up very well in a one-game setting. And then Mahomes, I think that was one thing we mentioned on the podcast. Correct me if we didn't, because I don't want to be like past post guy, but I'm nearly certain we mentioned his innate ability to avoid sacks when pressured. He was number 1 in the NFL, allowing pressures to not turn into sacks. And since 2018, when Mahomes has been under pressure, he's only been sacked 15% of the time. It's number 1 in the NFL. And sure, right, touch in a little factor that we didn't see coming, the field conditions helped pass protection as well.
I wanted to ask you about that, so I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, field conditions we saw in the wake of that performance, saying that was the single biggest contributing factor why Philadelphia wasn't able to generate a pass rush. I obviously don't agree with it. I know you don't when you look at Patrick Mahomes and how quickly he released the football. Do you think it's more, and we've talked about this at great lengths, and I think it became more pronounced in the lead up to the game and even in the aftermath, just some of the disdain from the casual fan towards the Kansas City Chiefs, that they were looking for any shred of evidence, any silver lining to try and explain why Philadelphia's tenacious defensive line, one that had accumulated 78 sacks over the course of the regular season, the playoffs, weren't able to get after Mahomes. But even in optimal conditions, I'm not sure Philadelphia still has a path to try and get there, largely because Jonathan Gannon doesn't make adjustments. And Kansas City had a lot more success than even I anticipated on the early downs, that they were never in truly known passing situations on 3rd and longs.
If you are an elite pass rusher who's just kind of dominated your way through the season because you've played poor offenses and you've played them in perfect game scripts for the most part, and all of a sudden you get to the Super Bowl and Mahomes is releasing the thing in 2.3 seconds, you can't get to him, and then suddenly you slip once or twice, like how frustrated are you? And I think you could see that set in. All of the motion that we talked about, right? Like, I mean, Sky Moore only ended up with 1 carry for 4 yards. He slipped himself trying to cut up field to gain more yardage on that exact play, but Kadarius Toney didn't get a carry. But virtually every single play had this wide receiver motioning across the field. So you see it in your eyes as a defensive end. You're like, shit, I got to contain the edge a little bit. I just can't get up the field like a banshee here. And then all of a sudden, like, the ground game got going, and you had to think about the run. And they were in great situations, as you alluded to, because the Chiefs were fantastic on early downs. I just think people look at wrong things. And it's the reason this podcast exists, because they come and they want to know what's truly happening. They don't want to hear the local guy with the hot takes. They don't want to turn on their television and listen to the hot take stuff. They want to hear what's actually going on. And I think you'll see Mahomes only throw for 182 yards. It was his lowest of the entire season. But they weren't on the field for a long time, right? They didn't have a lot of opportunities. As I, kind of go back to the top, the Eagles had the picture-perfect keep-away approach. It worked in the first half where the Chiefs only had the ball for 8 minutes, right? 2 less possessions. The Chiefs only had 8 possessions for the game, scored on 5 of them, did come away with 0 on a drive to the Eagles' 24, so should have scored on 6 of 8. Could have scored a touchdown on the last drive, but weren't trying to. And kind of where I'm going with this is, there wasn't enough opportunity for the volume stats to look amazing, for the layman to go to ESPN.com and hit the box score and be like, oh, like, how did they win this game? But Mahomes and the Chiefs' efficiency was through the roof. I mean, in terms of overall success rate, was this play successful? Was it not? The Chiefs had the second best success rate in Super Bowl history, 6th best performance of the entire NFL season. If you look at EPA per drive, the Chiefs had the best performance of any team this season. And, we thought Jonathan Gannon's defense was phony. Had played the easiest schedule of offenses, right? And had Shane Steichen and Jalen Hurts building him leads and making those poor offenses that Gannon faced pretty predictable. And you just go back to last season, the Eagles were 25th in schedule adjusted defensive efficiency. This year, 6th. It's nice to have a GM and an owner select a quarterback in the second round making $6 million over 4 years so you can go out and add James Bradberry for $7.5 million late in free agency when the competing teams had no salary cap left. I mean, I can tell you Bradberry spoke with the Chiefs. The deal was for $3.5 million. Right? That's all Brett Veach could offer. And then you make a trade for a slot corner in Gardner Johnson. You trade for Quinn. You sign Sue and Linval Joseph. Like, these are ends, defensive linemen, and corners. Like, all premium positions that just got added pretty close to the season or during the season that should have helped Jonathan Gannon. I mean, the guy had a treasure trove to work with. And ultimately, any offense that was top 10 that wasn't impacted by weather torched Gannon's defense this season. And honestly, it's going to continue to happen. You can't beat elite quarterbacks with this style of defense, and you're going to typically play elite quarterbacks in the playoffs and Super Bowl. The Eagles only got one in the Super Bowl. They didn't see one in the playoffs, right? But there's like a ceiling to this style of defense. And the one thing that we said, like, the Eagles can't really change their stripes. They've tried to play man. They go from the best zone defense to below average man defense on early downs the first 3 quarters. And you look at the last 2 seasons, something we said in the podcast prior to the Super Bowl, the Eagles had lost 5 of the 6 games they played the most man coverage. And the data says the Eagles played their highest rate of man coverage in the Super Bowl. So make that 6 of 7 where the Eagles lost the last 2 seasons under Gannon using their highest rates of man coverage.
Well, and that was one thing that stood out to me after you pointed out in the podcast. Obviously, it's tough to get a great idea of exactly what you're going to see from the Eagles week in, week out, because they stepped up in class so infrequently this year. I mean, the Eagles cornerbacks didn't challenge receivers at the line of scrimmage at all. They were terrible when the Chiefs used motion. We saw 2 wide open touchdown passes from Kansas City. And while you can be great at preventing explosive plays, but if you're giving up steady chunks, that doesn't accomplish anything either. It's different when you're talking about employing that kind of defense with 17-year-old kids in college football who need the explosive play because they can't sustain drives. When you go up against a Patrick Mahomes, you go up against a Joe Burrow, you go up against some of the elite quarterbacks in the league, they're going to take what you give them. And if you're constantly going to be in third and short, that opens up the entire playbook to a mastermind like Andy Reid.
And maybe that's a defensive style that gives Mahomes trouble in 2019 or at the beginning of 2020. But zone, right? Too high shell, that's all stuff that we've seen. That's all stuff that Mahomes was really starting to adapt to. And then you knew coming into this season without Tyreek Hill, the game plan kind of in the scheme had to mold to that even more. And so, when I look at this game, what's really interesting is it'll be viewed as the Chiefs really struggled in that first half. And again, I go back and watch, and I just look at some of the data, and it's like, the Chiefs only had the ball for 8 minutes in the first half. The opening drive was a masterpiece. The second drive was fantastic, other than the third and short call where you had Mahomes under center, only being able to use half the field. Andy Reid kind of took the ball out of his hand there, right? And then Andy elects to kick the field goal rather than going for it, and Butker missed the kick. But that wasn't the Chiefs getting stopped, right? I mean, they just ended a drive with 0 on a trip to the Eagles' 24. The second 2 drives of the first half, you had a negative play on first down that put you behind the down and distance, and a missed holding call on Juju on third down, and maybe that's a good lead-in. The final drive of the half, right, the Orlando Brown jumped a little bit early, and that penalty set you up with a 2nd and 15. So it wasn't really the Eagles stopping you. You kind of stopped yourself, and there just wasn't a lot of opportunity, only possessing the ball for 8 minutes.
We can get to the James Bradberry situation in a second. Obviously, I'm sure our listeners want to hear our take on the hold that was or wasn't. But my other question was, when you look at Philadelphia early on in the game, I was surprised that they thought Marcus Epps was going to be a matchup problem for Travis Kelce. Look, I'm not going to sit here and oversimplify trying to cover one of the best tight ends in the league, but I don't even know the best way to describe it. When you're watching Patrick Mahomes get comfortable in the pocket early on, make somebody else other than Travis Kelce beat you on the opening drive. Don't allow the best quarterback in the league and the best tight end to establish a connection early and be the reason that you gave up an immediate touchdown after you have a marathon march of your own to start the game up 7-0.
Yeah, I mean, again, it kind of goes back to, can you change your stripes? And we just kind of knew the middle of the field would be open. We had seen situations earlier this year with some heavy sets where the Eagles defensively just had a hell of a time defending those looks. And the Chiefs had a healthy set of tight ends. And all of the things that you kind of want to do with Mahomes and Kelce, the Eagles don't really do that, right? We kind of talked about this a little bit. It's like, and granted, I believe Kelce ended the game with 6 catches, right? So he went under
all numbers,
every reception prop. Yeah, I mean, not to give them a shout out with what transpired this weekend, but prior to their app going down, you could have gotten 8 under minus 40 on Kelce catches this weekend, and we just knew it would balloon out because that was going to be you got the most popular weapon on one of the most popular teams playing in the biggest game in the world. That was kind of like, I'm kind of ingrained as a better not to do those things.
He did go over his yardage number regardless of where you got it. I didn't see him close in the 80s.
However, we talk about this all the time, right? If you're going over, go early. If you're going under, wait until the last possible minute. There was 83 and a half out there.
I didn't see
Travis
that.
Kelce.
The biggest one I saw was about 80. I was going to say 80 and a half, but I saw pretty much a consensus in the high 70s. So, if you shop around, you can always find the best of the number to go under somewhere with marquee players.
So to your point, like the little things we talked about, right? When Kelce lines up, is your defensive end going to chip him a little bit? Are you going to play the parallel to a basketball box and one where, you're jamming Kelce at the line and then you're, playing zone everywhere else. And it just didn't seem like that was the case. I mean, Travis Kelce, and I don't really want to pick on Marcus Epps, but Travis Kelce one-on-one is going to beat just about everybody. And so, again, it just goes back to Jonathan Gannon not having the right approach. And, I mean, Kelce, to this point, you're looking at a guy that I believe is 33 or approaching 33. He's just a little bit older than Gronk. And I know naysayers will dock him for not being like the best blocking guy. But the Chiefs have figured out a way to make him one of the most prolific tight ends without hindering longevity because he's not getting beat up on every single down battling with 300-pound linemen. And you could make the case that if he's able to play another 3, 4, 5 years, that might be the smarter approach to using these pass-catching tight ends.
Hey, look, if you add value in one aspect of the game, I'm not going to make a Tiger change his stripes and do something that's going to shorten the longevity of that career or take away some of the level of effectiveness that you can create as the number one receiving option in an offense predicated on a future Hall of Fame quarterback there. You brought it up, though, the hold, and it was a play that I actually texted you about because much like a lot of the other big plays, didn't have a chance to see it in real time on James Bradberry against Juju Smith-Schuster. And look, I went back, I watched it from multiple angles. I looked at the social outrage and everything else that came from it. As a hockey fan myself, I love games to play out. The last thing I want to see called in the third period or overtime of Game 7 is a penalty unless it's cut and dry. But honestly, Payne, I went into that thinking, all right, this is going to be real ticky-tack, but if you take a player off of his route, you spin him around, you grab him, and then James Bradberry taking the high road coming out admitting that, hey, look, it was a hold. Again, I don't understand some of the outrage that's out there. I can say what I want about Juju poking the bear and being Mr. TikTok boy, or whatever A.J. Brown referred to him, but that's a hold in the first quarter, that's a hold in the fourth quarter, and I get some of the outrage, but look, I'm not sure Philadelphia was marching at the length of the field to even force overtime anyways.
Yeah, it's tough because this really isn't the vibe of our podcast. But I will say, when you look at every angle and not just the TV angle, the one that you saw as you watch the game, you go back and watch some of the All-22 stuff, right? I mean, Juju's kind of coming in on emotion, and he's peeling back out, so there's that initial impediment. And then once he has kind of leverage on Bradberry's got his left arm around the left hip there, and the reason I don't love having conversations like this further past James Bradberry coming out is because of what he said in the postgame. I mean, he said, hey, I held him, I tugged the jersey, I tried effectively, I'm going to paraphrase here, but what he was saying was, game situation he thought allowed him to be a little bit more handsy, and Charles Sheffer's crew in general called very, went under expectation on penalties. It was 10.5. I believe they called 9 in this game, but had typically throughout the year had been a little bit flag happy. And it's right in front of their face, and it's a one-on-one matchup, and it was clear he impeded him. And I think where the conversation should die, and that's why I think it's a little disingenuous, right, and why we talk about the hot take stuff. Once Bradberry comes out, this shouldn't be topics on TV. There shouldn't be topics on radio following the game because, listen, like I don't know the right comparison here, but if I'm standing, 100 yards away from you, Todd, and you're driving your car and you swerve and you get in a little accident and you tell me, hey, there was like a raccoon, I had to swerve out of the way, and I'm like, nope, it was a dog. like the guy is telling you what he did, right? Your opinions and feelings at that point no longer matter. He told you he hold him. He told you he tugged the jersey. That's it. Move on.
When you look at the overall composite snapshot of everything on the defensive side, and obviously there's plenty to be excited about. We'll get to the Eagles on the other side of the ball in a second. Arizona electing to go in the direction of Jonathan Gannon to be the face of their organization, to take them out of the depths of despair with a mercurial quarterback under center and Kyler Murray. Were you surprised that, given what we saw in his final audition on the biggest stage in the game in the Super Bowl, that Jonathan Gannon didn't even have to pack his bags and head back to Philly? He could start apartment hunting or looking for a new home somewhere in the Phoenix, Scottsdale area.
Yeah, I won't go too far into this, excuse me, because we typically do our off-season podcast post-draft and probably have some feelings on coaching, and I want to dig into this a little bit more, but in terms of like how he got hired, I certainly didn't think he was the right man for the job. But again, I believe Cliff Kingsbury, if you back out like FCS opponents, had a losing record at Texas Tech and somehow had, a double-digit win season with Arizona. So it's possible. And listen, I mean, this whole thing for the Eagles is a little bit of found money. I mean, congratulations to Howie. I don't know how he flipped this so quickly, but I mean, there was one stage here recently where, like, is Howie on the way out? And he just kind of hit all the right buttons. I mean, I can tell you internally, like, Nick Sirianni, depending on who you spoke to in that organization, was like option 7 or option 9. Okay. And now he's in the Super Bowl and both his coordinators are being hired. I mean, it was like 2 years ago. So, it's very difficult to figure out if this is going to work, but you're bringing in a defensive mind. So I think guys know how we feel about that. You have a quarterback who's going to get paid $1 trillion or is being paid $1 trillion already. Like, I mean, just you would think you would want an offensive mind. So I just didn't know if it was overly earned, especially, again, like I think you go back and he had a bottom 10 defense last year. This year it was a top 10 defense, but was highly predicated on all the talent that he had to work with and a really piss-poor schedule. So that was a little bit surprising to me. I think I don't really want to crap on Jonathan Gannon here because when you look at this Super Bowl, one of the things to me that has to be stated is how freaking good Jalen Hurts was. And somehow it's crazy that we're like 25 minutes into this and we haven't even mentioned Jalen Hurts.
Well, and that's where I wanted to get to. I obviously wanted him to get his accolades because you go out there and you'd have told me before the year, Jalen Hurts is going to be an overachiever from the fantasy side. He's going to be able to lean on his legs and provide an element of Philadelphia's offense that we hadn't seen in the past. Payne, I'm not going to lie. I mean, I saw that passing prop getting bet under by guys that I really respect and figure the game script would play a role in all of that. I never imagined that Jalen Hurts could go out there on a stage that large, put together such a performance, and kind of be an afterthought given that the way the game unfolded in the fourth quarter.
I mean, I was watching it unfold, and I'm like, I don't know how this is happening, and it was very much goes back to what I said. They were playing keep away, but the path to getting there was wildly different than any of us expected. I mean, he had looked very poor post-shoulder injury. Now, he had 2 weeks to get healthier, take the shot, whatever he had to do to play in this game. But, I mean, he had just regressed so much post-shoulder injury. And honestly, if you gave Super Bowl MVP to players on losing teams, Hurts would have gotten it. He played out of his mind. I mean, he was the only reason the Eagles had a chance. You look, 71% of Hurts' runs were successful. And they came in high leverage situations. I mean, 4th and 5. The accuracy was outstanding, 10% over expectation. The throw that we talked about, I think maybe off the show, right? The 3rd and 14 to Goddard in a pressure-packed situation because the Chiefs had just come down, scored the opening drive touchdown, cut it to 3. You're sitting in 3rd and 14. You're thinking, damn, we're about to give it back to the Chiefs. And you couldn't have handed that ball to Goddard any better on 3rd and 14. And I think the one thing that, we said the Chiefs had to do was get Hurts in throwing situations. And they did. Hurts was just that good. If you look at late down passing EPA, Jalen Hurts, positive 1.01. There was a 1 in front of the decimal there, okay? I mean, every time there was a late down pass that left Jalen Hurts' hands, the Eagles were expected to score more than 1 point on that late down pass. And for context, Mahomes was number 1 this season in those late down situations at 0.49 EPA. So Jalen Hurts was double that in the Super Bowl. And you could see it in the basic drive data. I didn't think Spags' defense was playing as poorly as the scoreboard was indicating in the first half. I mean, that Eagles' first drive ended with a touchdown, but they had to convert 3rd and 6 and a 2nd and 10. And then you fast forward to the 5th drive the Eagles had, which ended in a touchdown. They had to convert a 2nd and 10, a 4th and 5, and a 4th and 2. You go to the next drive right before the end of the half, I believe it ended in a field goal. They had to convert a 2nd and 10 and a 3rd and 5. And then drive 7, which we kind of talked about there, the possession out of the break for Philly that ended in a field goal. To get those 3 points, Philly had to convert a 2nd and 10, a 3rd and 6, a 2nd and 9, a 3rd and 14, and a 4th and 1. And then even the last drive where you are down 8 and go and score, you have a 3rd and 5 situation, you hit A.J. Brown again. So Jalen Hurts was fantastic in late down situations. There wasn't a lot of data. It was a small sample size, but we talked about Jalen Hurts playing from behind. I mean, once the Chiefs went up 8, I was like, ooh, this thing's probably over here. And that drive was just absolutely epic. I know L'Jarius Sneed had the blown coverage on the deep pass to Devontae Smith, so it was a help there. But when you think about Jalen Hurts' performance in the context of we thought the Eagles might be able to run the ball really efficiently here and weren't, which we can dive into here if you want, but I was shocked at how the Eagles were uber efficient offensively. I thought Jalen Hurts would be okay, right? He had the 2 weeks, but the running backs did nothing. That was a surprise to me.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about it going in. Who was going to be the bell cow back? We know Miles Sanders took very real professional money over his yardage number, over his carries, and clearly underwhelmed. I'm not sure if he was injured when you look at him potentially being in the concussion tent or whatever the hell it was after the first carry of the game where he was bottled up and then fumbled. Kenneth Gainwell took on a bigger role than I think most of us anticipated, but Kansas City basically forced Philadelphia to throw, and credit to Jalen Hurts, he answered the bell on most of those opportunities because that was clearly their game plan going in, that they were not going to allow this Eagles offensive line to maul them at the point of contact and run for 250 yards like we'd seen the Eagles do week in, week out throughout the course of the season, and remind us why they were an offense that had scored a record number of rushing touchdowns earlier in the campaign.
Listen, I don't know if Spags is a head coach. I really don't. And certainly, sometimes the Chiefs get a little bit beat up against really good offenses, and there isn't a ton of talent on that defense. You got a couple nice players. There was, a shift defensively to go younger and faster, and you got a ton of kids in the secondary. I mean, Trent McDuffie's in perfect position on the A.J. Brown touchdown. He is in picture-perfect position. He's got inside leverage. He's got Thornhill behind him, and he just doesn't adjust on the ball well. But you think about Spags in general, he seems to have the right game plan, right? I mean, you go back the previous game against the Bengals, and it's like, hey, we need to play more press man here. We need to make Burrow hold in an extra tick, think about it, go to his second or third option. Perfect game plan. I mean, this was a guy who stifled Tom Brady twice in the Super Bowl, so it shouldn't be all that shocking, but the metrics said it was, right? I mean, but Spags came out and the Chiefs stopped the run in terms of running back runs. Hurts was efficient and kind of distorts the overall rushing numbers because he was successful on 71% of runs, but every single Eagles running back didn't sniff expectation, right? Sanders wasn't close to your point in attempts or yards. He was lined 12.5 or 13.5 carries. His rushing number got steamed well into the 60s. His, most rushing yards opened at like plus 175. That ended up becoming a favorite to have the most rushing yards of anyone in the game. Boston Scott fell short of attempts at 3.5. His rushing numbers were like 12.5, 10.5, and even 8.5, which all got smoked by sharp bettors. That came in. Gainwell ended up with more opportunity than expectation, but if you went under 22.5, that cashed. I mean, you look at the trio of running backs. On just running back runs, they were successful in 35% of rushing attempts. The Seahawks were dead last in the NFL in rushing success rate this season at 36%, so it kind of just paints that picture. That was the matchup that I was worried about, that every Chiefs fan was worried about, that every bettor that was backing the Chiefs were worried about. That was the one thing in the back of our head. We're like, are we just going to get bullied here, right? The most efficient running offense going against a middling run defense that played the second easiest run schedule and was used to playing light boxes. And the Eagles running backs did like zip and pip. And somehow, now as you kind of think about this, it was the Chiefs run game that somehow was able to get going.
Oh, I mean, the Chiefs absolutely dominated on the ground. I mean, that when you look at the rushing props that were available, total cumulative rushing yards for the Chiefs, anywhere from 99.5 on the low end, upwards of 102.5 at close. Philadelphia substantially higher. I believe it closed, anywhere in that 158.5 range, slightly into the 160s. And on the flip side, you look at Patrick Mahomes, who got a 50-yard head start if you were trying to bet him head-to-head yardage against Jalen Hurts. And it was the exact opposite that unfolded in every aspect of the game. And you've drummed into my head that passing is more efficient in the modern game in 2022, 2023, but it's all about trying to stay ahead of the down and distance and having that whole playbook there available to you in those third and intermediate situations. Kansas City did a better job. Jalen Hurts, if he doesn't put together the best game of his NFL career and pull a Houdini act on some of those long yardage situations, I mean, this game looks substantially different than it did with a 38-35 Chiefs win. Kansas City wins this contest going away by double digits.
That was interesting because I think we touched on it during the podcast. And to your point, the Chiefs team rushing was at 103.5 at one point and got smoked. And when we were recording, it was down to like 99.5. And then you get the trickle up because the public's betting everything over. And then I had sent you from an account that is shared. There was a rogue 134.5 Eagles over rushing. And to your point, that closed in the high 150s and just, neither number got there. But whether it was Pacheco, Mahomes, or McKinnon, all exceeded their rushing prop numbers. 48% of the Chiefs' runs were successful. All running plays for the Chiefs churned out a positive 0.15 EPA per rush. Pacheco his running style is a little unique, but he ran possessed. 53 of his 76 rushing yards came after contact. And I think the other thing here is surprising, is what I will call this, is like we thought leading up to this game, and I think we said it, and I'm sure people have heard it everywhere, that the Eagles were like the more complete team. The Chiefs just have the best player in the field. But it was Jalen Hurts or nothing for the Eagles, really. And for the Chiefs, like, sure, Mahomes, had electric efficiency, but it was the Chiefs with the ground game that was a little bit better. It was the Chiefs with the defensive score. It was the Chiefs with the better adjustments. It was Kansas City with, the big special teams play. And that was not expected. I mean, Kadarius Toney hit his, anytime touchdown prop, plus 370 that Billy gave out in his article on our website, but he was held under 2.5 catches. He was held under any of his, fluctuating receiving yards numbers, but he showed up on special teams. And, that return is partly coaching. It's partly execution, right? I mean, the Eagles, if you're following this closely, elected to go with Aaron Sipos instead of Brett Kern. Sipos was returning from an injury that kept him out the last 6 games, and ultimately he shanks the punt, right? The Chiefs had it blocked to the right. The Eagles wanted Sipos to punt right. Instead, Sipos shanks the damn thing, and once Toney kind of wiggled his way out, everything was set up perfectly to the right. And, another huge acquisition by Brett Veach. I know Toney battled some injury stuff, as he always does, but in the biggest moment on the biggest stage, has the touchdown, has the massive return in the playoffs in totality. I mean, Kadarius Toney had 6 punt returns. 5 of them exceeded expectation. Nearly 70 yards of returns greater than expectation for Kadarius Toney on his 6 playoff punt returns. We think about this all the time and why the Chiefs sometimes don't have great special teams efficiency. It's because we just want you to catch the ball because we can't have it coming out of Mahomes' hands, right? But now all of a sudden you get Mahomes short fields. Right, you get Mahomes short fields, it becomes a cheat code. So, I mean, Kadarius Toney, again, didn't have the greatest Super Bowl aside from the touchdown, but made a massive play here on special teams, which changed everything.
Were you surprised when you looked at the way some of the prop markets moved, or with some of the late money that we saw in Kansas City? I was stunned, I'll be honest. Reading some of the reports from various prominent sportsbooks across the country that they were overwhelmed with Eagles money, so much so that we saw numbers come out of the state of Pennsylvania yesterday that looked like everybody that was betting in the state of Pennsylvania played single-game parlays or 8-teamers, that there was roughly $85 million in handle, and it looked like $30 million in win. I just couldn't quite wrap my head around it when I looked at some of the splits and talked to books. I figured we'd be much closer to a 50-50 breakdown, not a 65-35 scenario where it was all one-way traffic on Philadelphia.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of recreational bettors are going to bet with their heart, and that's ultimately why they fail. And unfortunately, I have to say this, it's the reason there is an actual market. It's the reason we're able to bet into said market, mostly, although that's becoming a little more difficult.
I was going to say depends where and when. I mean, said market cap maybe about $72 in certain spots.
Without people betting with their heart, there's no market for professional bettors to attack. So, to your point, I think I mentioned, there's a couple rogue shops in Colorado that were offering 3, and I just completely slipped my mind. But even as we were recording on Thursday, prior to that, there were a bunch of rogue shops in the tri-state area that you could have got 3 on the Chiefs. And listen, I think books understood that they were going to be overloaded in that area with Eagles money. And when it falls that way, it's probably not going to be a good experience. I was a little surprised by the Vegas numbers, not necessarily handle being down, but that they did decently well, because they were a little inundated with some Eagles money, right? And you had the over, you had the first half over, you got the defensive touchdown. I mean, some of the long shot anytime touchdown props hit. I mean, Sky Moore, I think, was peaked at like 11-1. I mean, you had some, Kelsey anytime touchdown. Like, that was probably their largest liability in terms of anytime touchdown. And I think every single Eagles receiver from Devontae Smith to A.J. Brown went over, Juju went over. I mean, a lot of those guys, and, virtually, to your point earlier, every Kelsey passing yards number went over, aside from a couple rogue 83.5. So I was surprised that it was a decent-sized winner for the books.
Well, they've
outright.
actually reduced the numbers, and I'm not sure if you saw that. It looked like initially, it looked initially like it was.
It was like 7.4%.
Yeah, it looked like
right?
it was about 12 million. I want to say on roughly 150 million in handle. The revised numbers that came out yesterday was closer to 5.5 million. So that number came down substantially.
Okay. Yep.
And it is, and I won't claim to know the reporting methods in other states. It also should come with the caveat when you look at Nevada. All of the futures bets on the NFL for the Super Bowl post on Super Bowl Sunday. So that typically props up a lot of the figures that you've seen in the state of Nevada, and maybe the reason that the numbers, even after the reduction in overall win, still look a little bit better on the surface. Honestly, the only player prop that I could think of that helped the books in any capacity would have been to some extent what we talked about in the Philadelphia backfield, but those guys aren't generating a lot of buzz. The fact that all of the Mahomes numbers, other than touchdowns, completions, attempts, and yards all come in under as well.
Across the board, Miles Sanders was the biggest loser for professional bettors. All the guys that I speak with, I mean, over attempts, over rushing yards at 55.5, 57.5, most rushing yards of the game, plus 175, plus 160, down to plus 140. I mean, those were all substantial losers for a lot of the sharpest guys who were focused in on Miles
I got a couple
Sanders.
physical tickets if anybody wants to turn them into a coaster. If Philadelphia Eagles fans out there want a little bit of nostalgia. And you mentioned numbers. I didn't tell you this story. One of my buddies plays through a smaller local shop in eastern Pennsylvania. Still couldn't get himself, as a diehard Eagles fan, to take the Chiefs plus 3.5. I asked him what the limits were. He told me it wasn't going to be worth my time trying to track down a couple of those dollars. But it just goes to show that there are some of those prices still out there, and there are avenues to get some of the best numbers available. I didn't do it at the top.
Rumor has it, Todd, Miles Sanders is still running sideways on the opening.
Hey, you know what? At least he broke a couple of tackles, but every tackle he broke, he lost another half a yard. So I'm not quite sure what the productivity level there was by any stretch. But yeah, definitely not the best way to try and get the running backs on track. Should have done it at the top of the show or the middle, but I figure if people have been listening to us for the last 35 plus minutes, they already know who they're hearing from. You can follow Payne on Twitter at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Fuhrman. You can follow me there. And normally, Payne, I mean, this is where we go into the best bet portion of the show. We're not telling anybody to tie up money in futures markets for 360 days. So I'm actually going to flip the onus back to our loyal listenership and give them a little bit of a homework assignment that's going to be near and dear to me that I didn't tell you about before we were going to record.
Go ahead. I love a good surprise. You know
we
me.
are doing something a little bit unique. As you've told our listeners before, I'll be tying the knot in late April, and we still are trying to stay on brand for that particular event. So what we want to try and set up is a little bit of a prop contest for those guests in attendance. We may share it online as well, but I want to open up the Pandora's box to our listeners, stay obviously within boundaries. My better half is on social media to offer up props that you would like to see on a parlay card of sorts around a wedding, whether it's, first member of the wedding party to cry, will somebody fall down walking down the aisle. Be smart, be tactful, but want to have a little bit of fun with our loyal listeners who love to bust my chops, and rightfully so. We feel like we know them, they know us, so wanted to throw that out there to them on this podcast format and see what they kind of come up with.
Beautiful. I like that. How many things are going to show up on this?
It all depends. I mean,
how many we're going to have?
We're figuring, 8,
4 or
5.
I mean,
4 to 5.
Uneven
if
number.
there's better ones that are there, we'll get a little creative. But, we did our engagement shoot in a sports book. We figure I have to stick with the gambling theme, at least in some capacity. So getting some wedding props into the mix was something that we thought could be a lot of fun. And what better way than to crowdsource some of those potential possibilities than with our core demo, our listeners at the board that have been with us either a full season or for some of the folks, been out with us since 2014 for 500 plus episodes.
I got to tell you, it's extremely tacky. But if you're looking to capitalize a little bit on this wedding, one of the props has to be, fattest envelope. And
you know what?
That's going to work out in your favor. If
well,
that's
you know
on
what?
there,
I think
would guess just because there's going to be a lot of people.
You
competing in
have
that
you have to
situation.
be open with that kind of thing. I mean, fast. You can't put individual names, although
That's
you
true.
do have a pretty distinguished pecking order, I'm sure, of how that would be. But I think you have to break it into groupings. Like, is it family member? Is it member of the wedding party?
Gotcha.
Those kind of distinctions more so than anything else. Yes, if I'm setting odds like an MVP of the Super Bowl or anytime touchdown score, I got a pretty good idea, and there's going to be a lot of hurt feelings for people that aren't even going to be 100 to 1, that may be 10,000 to 1 on that particular order. And then, of course, there's always the dreaded no gift classification, because there are always a couple of those folks as well.
Yeah, the problem is, I'm told, because I'm not a big wedding guy, you would have up to a year to
get
the gift. So we wouldn't have the results for another 12 months. I don't know,
you know
if
what?
That's worth putting on there.
Would be the same thing for people that are betting NFL futures right now, and there might be a slightly higher hold in the futures market than what we'd have in the Todd Fuhrman wedding market in that capacity.
There you go. I like that.
I wanted to throw that out there. I know we've had a lot of fun doing these shows, and honestly, when we bid all of our listeners a fond farewell going into the Super Bowl, we didn't have expectations of doing a Super Bowl review, but I think a lot of great talking points, especially with the hot takes and the talking heads, are out there, that it's always great to get your perspective on what actually transpired on the football field, more so than what some of the media narratives being fed to people are, so they can properly process and use this to put an official bow on what's been a profitable football season for most, and most importantly, trying to make our listeners smarter every single week they tune in across a variety of various disciplines.
Absolutely. It was fun doing, and somehow we've managed to approach 50 minutes.
Well, I mean, you're a busy man now. Now that the offseason officially kicks off, I mean, you're a man about town, meetings, social gatherings, hobnobbing, spending time with family, so we can't keep you all that long. But again, hey, look, this podcast never gets off the ground if it wasn't a brainchild that you and I put together. Years ago, you pitched it to me. I kind of laughed and never would have imagined that it would take on a life of its own with the listenership as strong as it's been, the strong turnout for our prop contest and everything else. 500 episodes. Maybe we do 500 more. But do you want to offer up any TV show recommendations or things along those lines? Because it'll be a little while before we reconvene for March Madness, about 3 weeks from now.
Reputation on the line. That's a little bit. I have to think about that.
Well, that's what social media is for.
I don't want
to. You don't have to do it at a moment's notice here. I won't put you on the spot in
that
that regard. I wasn't sure if you had something on the tip of your tongue.
I know other people's time. They're watching mediocre shows, but the key to finding a good show is one that the most busiest of humans is willing to sacrifice a little bit of their time to watch. So let me come up with something that's not so obvious.
We'll have to be on the lookout for all of that. But again, thanks to all of you, our loyal listeners, for tuning in. Hopefully you found everything we did throughout the course of the season informative, made you guys a better sports bettor from start, whether you're a $5 bettor, 500, or even more than that. It's all about trying to make smart, informed decisions, getting the best of the number, and altering your thought process as we go through things. So for Payne Insider, I'm Todd Fuhrman. You can follow Payne on Twitter at Payne Insider. You can follow me there as well at Todd Fuhrman. Most importantly, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. Hopefully, in the meantime, we'll see you at the window.
Thanks for listening to Bet the Board. You can catch Todd and Payne every Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday during football season, breaking down the biggest NFL and college football games. And to make sure you don't miss any free best bets, subscribe to Bet the Board on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.